It's a disco era hot rod time capsule. So a few weeks ago, I bought this 383 off my buddy John. It's been sitting here in his pole barn for the last few years, and I needed some trinkets and odds and ends off of it. So I said, I'll just buy it, take what I need, and I'll either get rid of the rest or stick it up on the shelf, whatever. And then a funny thing happened. It started to occupy more of my imagination than any Derelict 383 should. But I really started to become curious about the motor, and I started thinking, well, what can I do with this? I don't know, right? But I want to do something with it. So I threw it out to you guys to tell me in the comments, a couple of videos back, what do you want to see us do with it? And the general consensus, best I could determine, was just tear it down, see what's wrong with it, fix it, put it back together again, and make it run as best as it can run. And you know what? I love that idea. It's just so simple and so straightforward. I don't really have anything to put it in, except maybe Das Hindenburg. We'll pull the propane motor out, throw this thing in, and play around with it. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. So I'm over here now, and I'm looking things over, getting ready to pull it over to my place, and I'm realizing this is a true 1980 or so, like disco era, 78, 79, 80, disco era time capsule. This is exactly the way things were done back during that period of time. Day three. So if you're not familiar with that term, this pertains to the muscle car era, right? Day one was the way the cars were built, off the assembly line and delivered to the dealer and driven off the lot. Stock. Day two typically happened in the first year or two of ownership. Whoever had the car would they'd throw some chrome wheels on it, headers, air cleaner, gauges, the typical, not too deep, right? Typical stuff. Day three happened after the cars reached about their 10th birthday. And this was an era that lasted between, let's say, 1975 and 1985. And this thing's right there in the middle of it. And that's where the cars were no longer, viable. Okay, they were old now, right? And most of them were heading off to the junkyard, and the ones that weren't heading off to the junkyard were becoming hot rods, street machines. Carcraft magazine ruled the day back then, and that's what this thing represents. So like I says, I'm over here and I'm looking it over and I'm like, time capsule, this is like priceless, right? It's really a trip back for me. Although I was never really into this stuff. I was like plain Jane, dog dish hubcaps and just like regular plain valve covers. I was never into the showy stuff. But I was surrounded by these things. And so the first thing I noticed, not even the engine, these are the tires and wheels that came on it. So these are chrome multi-lug, steel wheels, and the tires are JCPenney Scat Track radials. Right? Look at these things. They're brand new. There's no rubber missing off of them. They're dry rotted. This one here has got a bubble the size of a golf ball, so they're really not even good for burnouts anymore. But classic, right? That's 1979, 1980 exactly. Back then, there was no nothing. There was you couldn't order stuff online. Everything was, some stuff came through catalogs, but most of it came through speed shops. And whoever had this car, whoever had this engine, they spent a lot of time and a lot of money at the speed shop buying literally everything that they could. It's all here. But I tell you what, before I do that, before I get into what I found on this engine so far, let's do a quick recap on the 383 itself, because a lot of guys aren't really familiar with these engines. And I've really come to love these things. Never really paid them much attention back in the day. The 383 was always something like, oh, get rid of that, throw a 440 in it, or put a 426 Hemi in it, right? What are you gonna do with a 383? It's silly. I've come to really appreciate these things. And in my opinion, it's only my opinion now, these are the best engines Chrysler ever produced. Not the greatest, linguistics matter here, right? Obviously, the Max Wedge, the 426 Hemi, the 446 pack, those are great engines. But inch for inch, pound for pound, the 383 is the best. And the 383 represents the foundation. The B series engine represents the foundation that all of those great engines were built off of. So these things, the B series, so that would include the 350, which was a 1958 only engine, The 350, the 361, the 383, and the 400 were all produced between 1958 and 1978. The B engine, the low deck, which is what this is, was the original incarnation. So this is, when Chrysler engineers drew this engine up, this is exactly what they had in mind. The tall deck, the 413, the 426 wedge, the 426 Hemi, and the 440 all came afterwards. They added 3/4 of an inch of deck height and increased the stroke from 3.38 inches to 3 3/4 inches, and the bigger engines evolved from that. But this is what Chrysler originally intended this design to be, and it is a masterpiece. All right, a couple of things. The engines that this was replacing, intended to replace, were clean slate, right? They were the Chrysler Hemis, the Firepowers, the DeSoto, the Fire Domes, the Dodge Red Rams, and the Polyheads were all Chrysler-specific designs. These engines borrowed from other manufacturers, things that were state-of-the-art at the time. So, for instance, these are built on a deep skirt block. Now, back in 1958, racing, horsepower, technology, that sort of thing, wasn't at the level where, let's say, reinforcing the main saddles was a big deal. The reason why they went to the deep skirt was more of an NVH type of thing, noise, vibration, and harshness. Because the deep skirt not only kept like sounds like the oil splashing off the oil pan, that tinny kind of sound, it did away with any of that, and it also soaked up a lot of the harmonics. The more block you have, the more cast iron there is, the more of a sink there is for the vibrations as the engine's going down the road. Their primary objective was smoothness. They wanted this thing like silent and smooth like glass. So that was the main reason for going for the deep skirt. It wasn't until later that, like for instance, it wasn't until 1964 when they did the 426 Hemi that they even added cross bolts. So the deep skirt really does nothing to reinforce that weak area in the block between the saddle and the cam journal. That's all besides the point. They borrowed that from Ford. That was the Y block and the FE. Brand new engines at the time, and really state-of-the-art engines at the time. For the cylinder heads, they went to Chevrolet. So the big block cylinder head is as close to being a small block Chevy as you could be without actually being a small block Chevy. They're slightly bigger in every dimension, and they use rocker shafts instead of the ball stud assembly that the Chevys use. But the combustion chambers, the ports, the port layout, all of that, water jackets, it's like a direct copy of the small block Chevy cylinder head. Fantastic design. Chrysler also used basically the blueprint of the Chevrolet oiling system as opposed to the Ford one, which was like, nutty, right? Chrysler used the Chevrolet, and actually it's very close to the original Chrysler, the Hemi oil routing, but that's all besides the point. From Chevrolet, they also used the 17-bolt cylinder head. So previous Chrysler engines, and the A motor, the Poly, the LA, and then the Magnums, all used 4 bolts per cylinder. So there's 10 bolts for each cylinder head. The Chevrolet used 17 bolts and puts 5 bolts around each cylinder. So that's what they did with this B motor over here. And it's one of the reasons, it's one of the things that allowed the 426 Hemi to evolve to the point that it has today. 12,000 horsepower out of 500 cubic inches. One of the main reasons. And the architecture really hasn't changed very much from the original. Obviously, everything's been straightened, everything's evolved. But the basic architecture is still true to the original B-Series design. It's one of the reasons that inherent strength is one of the reasons why it's able to evolve the way it did. The Hemi could never have been the Hemi without the virtues of the B motor. So, they built these things, they built 3 million of them, 383s, between 1959 and 1971, and it was replaced by the 400. They're all 3.31 inch stroke, 4 1/4 inch bore. Most of those 3 million were just regular pedestrian engines. You'd find them in Chrysler Newports and station wagons and small trucks and stuff like that. There were several high performance versions through the years. They took a back seat to the bigger engines, but nevertheless, they were there, and some of them were pretty potent. So from the get-go, the 383 was available both with the crosser and the long ram setup, the sonoramic commandos, and also dual quad setups. 1962, they had a special package. It was higher compression, came with a cam, dual quad intake, and headers. And it was the 343 horse 383, and that was intended for stock eliminator racing. It was one of those dealer installed packages where you bought the car and all of the stuff came in the trunk. The dealer would install it for you. So that was probably the highlight of production 383 performance. For the rest of the years, it was from 63 on, it was only available in a single 4-barrel, the performance version. The 2-barrel was always rated somewhere between 8.5 to 1 compression and always rated somewhere between 270 and 290 horsepower. The high performance version from 63, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 1970 were all 10.25 to 1 compression. 1971, and this is an 1871 engine, they dropped the compression to 8.5 to 1, so it uses the same pistons as a 2-barrel engine. And they rated it at 300 horsepower. That's really, really conservative. It wasn't just a compression loss. So the 4-barrel engines, the Magnums and the Commandos, were rated at 330 and 335 horsepower, depending which body they were in. They dropped the rating in 1971 to 300, and it was more to appease the insurance companies than anything else, including that 335 number. I believe that was also deliberately published lower for the insurance reasons and keep the insurance companies happy. But these are 8.5 to 1. The 71 is 8.5 to 1 compression, rated at 330 horsepower. And then that was the last year for these. They all had steel cranks until 1971. 1971, the automatics, and this is an automatic, was the first year to get a cast crank. And then 1972, they increased the bore and they went to the 400, also a cast crank. Exception to that would be 4-speed engines. 1971 4-speed and 383s, and 1972 400s all used a forged steel crank, but this would be a cast crank engine. What else is there? And what am I leaving out of the history of these things? They built 3 million of them. They're still around. You can buy them for a song, and they make fantastic engines to build. You could do a stroker, you cut down the mains on a 440 crank, you drop it in here, you get a 426 low deck wedge. There's so many possibilities with these engines, but they're happy. They respond to everything. A lot of the literature from back in the day said that for the high performance engines like the Roadrunners and the Super Bs, the literature, the advertising literature said, well, yeah, we used the 440 heads on the 383, and that's not true. The 440, the B and the RB always shared cylinder heads. The only exceptions to that would be the Max Wedge and the 1967 440 head, which was closed chamber with a 1.74 exhaust as opposed to the 1.6s that were found on all the other engines. Beginning in 1968, they all had the same cylinder head, 440, 383, and they all had that 1.74 exhaust valve. So no, they didn't steal parts, camshaft and cylinder heads off of 440 to hop up to 383. They came with them automatically. All right, I think that's enough of a rundown. I probably put most of you to sleep. So let's look at this engine, right? Because like I said, it's a time capsule, and I'm curious about a lot of things. All right, so looking the motor over, it has, I can see the casting date on here, and it's got a June 1970 casting date. So that would be correct for a 71 383. Now, curious thing about this engine is that it's painted blue. Now, these engines came from the factory orange. And you can see that this is somebody painted this after the fact. Now, this engine, and you look at certain areas of it, like on the oil pan, you can see the blue paint peeling off, and there's the orange underneath. And you can see it in other places as you look around the engine. So it was originally orange, as a 71 383 should be, and then for some reason they painted it blue. It's usually the other way around. Usually they take a blue engine and paint it orange so it looks like a hot rod motor, but no, they went the other way. Now what's interesting about the paint job on this, and what really makes me curious, is that it's obvious that this thing was painted when it was apart. There was nothing on this engine when it got painted, which means that during this period of time that all of this stuff was added to it, it was gone through. Right now, whether it was just resealed, you know, gaskets or whatnot, or it was hot rodded where it's got pistons and a cam and whatever, I won't know that until we actually crack it open. But because it was painted with none of the accessories on it, that tells me that this thing was out and probably apart during that period of time. Now I can also tell that this engine didn't have much use after it was. So this is what sidelined it. Something exploded the back of the transmission. The main part of the trans is fine. Where it usually blows up is nothing wrong with it. But back here at the tail shift, it broke there and it broke the yoke. So something happened to upset the back of this assembly and sidelined it. I won't know until we actually pull it apart. You know, what damage, if any, the engine incurred during that mishap. But at that point you could tell it was parked. Now, the intake, so it's got a Y-end intake, and you can see inside it's clean. I pulled the carburetor off of this. It had a Holley carburetor on it, and the carburetor was seized up, but like zero like carbon or no signs of it ever being run. It looks like a brand new carburetor that just sat and sat and sat. So my guess is that they did this, they put this engine together, put all of this stuff on it, around it, and it ran it for just the shortest period of time. I guess as the tires still have tons of rubber on them. And it broke, and it was parked ever since. So, but the YN single plane intake manifold, you know, classic. I mean, even to this day, excellent manifold to use. The Cal Custom valve covers, these wing nut things on the to hold down the valve covers. This is another deal from the era. Back then, engines had mechanical rockers that were raced. If you wanted to make valve adjustments between rounds, you had to do it really, really fast. And so they would add these T-handles so you could just whack the valve cover off real quick without breaking out tools. Well, this was like a style thing of the day. Like just about every hot rod engine on the streets in like 1979, 1980, all had these. This engine has original hydraulic rockers, so these are just like for decorations. You got the classic Cal Custom valve covers, and just as like, you know, true to the day, they're painted blue inside the fins. Usually these would get polished out. You'd paint inside the fins and then you polish the top of the fins. But you know, these were all painted nice. They sprung for a lot of chrome on this. Look at this, chrome power steering pump. Now you know this wasn't a real hardcore engine because it was a power steering motor. Most hardcore guys at the time would have automatically converted to manual steering, because you don't want the weight and the parasitic loss of power steering on a true hot rod. So this is one indication that I may find nothing but just stock stuff inside, but nevertheless, nice chrome brackets, nice chrome pulleys. It's a shame this stuff is as rusty and corroded as it is, but that's what happens when things sit for 40 years at a clip. Chrome alternator brackets, chrome heater hose holders. Just, you know, they really went out of their way to doll this thing up. This engine must have been just gleaming in the day. It had to be beautiful. It's got a stock single point distributor in it, which would have been the standard thing for an automatic, you know, 3D3 of the day. And you can tell that it's the original one because it has this electronically operated retard deal built into it. This was like 1971 only. But you can see that it's got a Mallory Unilight conversion. So long before Petronics, the Mallory Unilight was the thing to use. And these things are freaking great. They're like bulletproof. Let me see if I can get this off of here. I don't want to break this. I don't want to break this. But there's the unit right down there. It's a Hall's effect. It uses a light, you know, to an optic signal. And a very simple setup too. If I remember correctly, the green goes to the negative on the coil, the red goes to the positive on the coil, and the black goes to the ground. And that's it. Boom. You got spark. So this was Pertronics long before there was Pertronics. These were introduced right around 1975, 1976, and a really, really common thing. This was probably added before they had the whole distributors. So I'm going to say, yeah, very late 70s. This unit, I will guarantee this thing still works. So we'll get to that later on. This thing sat with the valve cover off, so it's kind of grungy in there. But just wipe off the dirt real quick, and you can see that it's really from sitting. It's not that this engine was dirty, running dirty. It's dirty because it sat for 30 years in a barn or something with the valve cover off. So, I think it's much cleaner once we get inside. Because like I says, you know, they painted it apart. And generally speaking, when you paint, when the engine's, you know, all of the stuff is off of it, the engine had to be out for them to do that painting on it. They might have gone inside. We might find some goodies in there. I've found some pretty impressive stuff inside of engines that you would normally say, ah, it's boat anchor, throw it away. We'll find out soon enough. What else was on here? The dipstick. I got a lot of hope for the inside condition of this engine because that's exactly the way I pulled the dipstick out. So it's not like it got flooded with water or anything like that. So we should be in good shape there. These wires, nothing caused more misfiring and tune-up issues and mysteries than these braided wires. They would trap moisture and just start arcing away like crazy. They needed, when you use these braided wires, like I said, these were the rage during that, like that disco era hot rod thing. When you use these, you had to ground them. So you see it's got this deal right here, and it's grounded to this lanyard, to the block, and here's the one for the other side. So I seriously thought we're going to use these things, but they're definitely a conversation piece for sure. See, like, look at the contacts on the rotor. Yeah, on the cap. You know, obviously, you know, this stuff is destroyed, but it shows very, very little wear. You know, it's not all carboned up. Only ran for a relatively short period of time. So, and then of course, the bane of every Mopar with headers is the starter. So this is obviously before the mini starters came along. This is the full-size gear reduction, and it's actually the high torque gear reduction. Big, giant, heavy thing. And when you put headers on these, the only way to get this starter in and out is to unbolt the whole header and take the header and the starter down in one shot. You have to cradle the header in the you have to cradle the starter in the header pipes to get it in and out. And then once you go to put it back in, the header has to be positioned in just such a way that it's up like this, so that you can maneuver the starter into position. It is hell. It is a hell job. It's like the worst thing you'll ever have to do on one of these Mopars. All right, I think I covered all of this stuff that I wanted to, that I noticed on this, and there's going to be a lot more, obviously, when we pull this apart. So just a quick tour, quick history of the 383, the engine that I honestly consider to be the best Chrysler ever built. I know, not the greatest, but the best. And you're going to be seeing a lot more of this in the very near future. I'm going to drag it over either tomorrow or the next day, and we'll start tearing it apart. Maybe we'll do some of it live, maybe. I just got to see how things work. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you tomorrow.